TVAC, what's going on? Happy Friday, TGIF. Thank God it's Friday here. Um, this semester has proven challenging for me in terms of having the class broken down into three sections and trying to do topics that span more than one day or a week, it's become challenging to maintain a thread of discussion. So like we're doing gender this week, and like some of you are like, don't know that because this whole Simpsons thing. I apologize for that. I totally forgot that Simpsons episode that I used to in this unit has been, I guess, scrubbed from the internet. Now I have it on DVD. Yeah, those DVDs are gonna come in handy someday when our robot overlords take over. Um, so we were able to watch the correct episode in class. Some of you watched Miss Lisa Goes to Washington, which is a great episode. I use that in a different class in political humor. Anyway, that is supposed to set the stage for the rest of the week talking about gender. So I apologize for that. I just figured, just scrap the whole thing. But it did lead to one of the funnier things that I've experienced in teaching in a while. And that was everybody who watched Who's the Boss, or many of you who watched Who's the Boss, without knowing that it was about gender, sort of watching it on your own, immediately thinking that they were husband and wife, that Tony and Angela were husband and wife. I laughed out loud. And I'm not one to use that popular turn of phrase. I think it's hilarious that you guys were like, oh my God, I thought they were married with two kids. They are not. In fact, Samantha is Tony's daughter. You should have got this by the end. Samantha is Tony's daughter, and Jonathan is Angela's son. So, and the situation is this. Tony's wife died, and they moved out of the Bronx up to, Snooty, Connecticut, to be the housekeeper for Angela, who runs the Bauer Agency, her own ad agency, and she's divorced. So that's how that all comes together. The redhead, Mona, is Angela's mother, and you're supposed to ask yourself, who is the boss? And Who's the Boss is part of the 80s gender boom that was, that really swept the entire. I mean, it started with 9 to 5. The movie 9 to 5 came out in 1980 and really kind of set the tone for this new gender movement. And it basically had everything to do with women going back to work and seeking equal pay and all those kinds of things. So any family sitcom from the 80s has an established mother who also has a job. And it's usually a big time job. So that's a thing. But the flip side of it was also a butler boom, so to speak, in that there were plenty of shows like Who's the Boss was the best of them all, but Charles in Charge and Mr. Belvedere and Benson and Who's the Boss, like 4 shows about basically male housekeepers, maids, butlers, whatever you want to call it. So clearly they're playing with, okay, if women are moving into more male spaces, what's the fallout if men start moving into female spaces? And like I said, who's the boss handles it. I think, I mean, easily the best of those shows that I mentioned. Um, but it handles it better than the family sitcoms do too, because the family sitcoms are mostly about, like we were talking about, exploration versus exploitation of this, right? It was just like, oh, now Claire Huxtable has a job. She's a lawyer. There's no process of, they're not exploring what she had to go through to become a lawyer, or her struggles as a lawyer, if there are any. And Elise Keaton is an architect on Family Ties. We don't see that. She's just, the sausage is made, if to continue a shitty analogy for the semester. So, and with the gender boom, right, that saw women going back to work, that saw men moving into female spaces traditionally, you had shows like The Golden Girls, where it's like, oh, old women are women too, and they like to fuck. Basically, that was what Golden Girls was about. So Mona sort of represents that part of gender roles, right? She's this sort of sex starved, like, octogenarian, which is hilarious. I don't know what it is, but it was a thing. I mean, the Golden Girls was for real. So if you're looking at the show itself, and I've mentioned this a bunch of times, there are no coincidences in, especially in the sitcom game. So if this show is about gender, duh. But it's certainly a more nuanced look at it than most sitcoms, even now, I think, make. Every character confronts some sort of gender norm and sort of shakes it a little bit, right? So you obviously have Angela and Tony set against each other, right? The male housekeeper, the female CEO, basically. You have Mona doing her thing, but the kids do too. The kids cut against these kinds of things, right? Samantha, who's the girl, she's a tomboy. She loves sports, flannel, jeans. Like, they really like dude her up for much of the series. Um, to, I think, call those things into question, right? Why do girls have to wear dresses? Those kinds of things. Those um, seemingly superficial things, but systemic things for sure. And Jonathan, on the flip side, he's a very feminized little boy. He's not into sports. Um, he's small. He has this high voice. I'm not implying, I'm not conflating gender and sexuality here. He's smart. He's good at school. Like, all these things that typically were feminine, especially for kids back then. So he's certainly a feminized version. So all of this is happening. And, I talked about this in class, so I apologize if you're watching this and you're hearing it again. But, Alyssa Milano became, I mean, one of the most influential sex symbols of the 90s as a result of this. So the irony is, Alyssa Milano, the sort of muted woman, right? The the tomboy, became this huge sex symbol. And Danny Pintaro, who played Jonathan, ended up coming out of the closet and being, in real life, gay. Um, there's something there. I don't know what it is, but for me, this is my truth. I was in love with Samantha Maselli, Alyssa Milano, in the show Who's the Boss. Now I was 12, so not I had to make this clear in class. Like 12-year-old me was watching the show and thinking, "Oh my God!" Right? Sort of this gender duality. Like I was having these new feelings about this girl, like that were sexual in nature. But I didn't know whether I wanted to have sex with her or play catch with her. And realized as a result of watching Who's the Boss that I don't have to choose. I can find a girl that is both, that I both am attracted to and can play sports with me. That's transformative for a 12-year-old boy. At least this one. That was my takeaway. And I married an athlete, if that makes. Thank you. Who's the boss? I don't know. I apologize for this tangent, but I do think it's important. Anyway, um, as women were moving into more masculine spaces, men were accepting more feminine roles. I've already said that stuff. So this is an episode from the first season of Who's the Boss in 1984, and the show ran for like 8 seasons. But you think about who's the boss, the question, the title itself, like who's the boss, um, really raised questions with the audiences that were like, wait, of course the guy's the boss. Like that's just how it is. Like think about that, right? The show itself is like, oh, maybe the guy isn't the boss. Maybe there's a different boss. Like when at a time when this question seemed um, stupid. Who's the boss? Well, obviously the guy is. Well, not really. Let's look at it, right? That's what the show is doing. I think it's exploring that notion of bossness and that being the boss doesn't necessarily mean being male anymore. And that was revolutionary for a lot of people. I know, sad. I always make this comment like the saddest thing about the 80s was that just the concept of women going to work was so hilarious. Like it spawned so much comedy, like movies and TV specifically, that that's sad. But here we are. We're better for it. One might argue. Um, every aspect of Who's the Boss seeks to dismantle our preconceived notions of gender. Right down, like I said, right down to Mona being, you know, cock hungry. I guess for there probably is a better term. I was going to say for lack of a better term, but there probably is one. So there. Um, yeah, that's what I was just saying. It's called Who's the Boss for a reason. People were like, wait, there's another boss. And I think the question that this episode specifically raises with regards to who's the boss is why does there necessarily have to be a boss? Like, why do we have to make these? I mean, obviously there has to be a boss, I'm saying, but the boss concept that they're playing with is sort of calling traditional bossery into question. So what happens in the episode, right? Like, it's challenging all these different gender roles and societal norms, and it's breaking them down for the most part. But the big takeaway and what drives the whole episode and its value, I think, is before Tony has the little powwow with the other maids in the neighborhood, their relationship is fine. They both seem very content with their roles, right? There's a give and take, there's trust, there's respect, and they're happy. They hang out sometimes, right? They watch the movie, they drink and kick the bottle of wine. Tony does his job well. Angela, as a result, has the time to do her job well, and they relate with the kids and all this stuff. Like they have this little utopia basically carved out in their house, in their relationship. And it's not until the outside world comes in, culture steps in and sees it and says, okay, that's different and it's not my experience. And as a result, it is wrong, right? All the maids are like, oh, no, you're doing it wrong. And only then does Tony start to question his situation. That's the takeaway. Like, most of us have had this experience at some point where we're happy and we're doing, we're just doing us, as it were, and then somebody says that's not the way to do it. Then you start to question yourself and doubt and insecurity, and all these things start to creep in, and all of a sudden you're painting a car red without permission, right? So that's the biggie, and that everything sort of spirals out of control from there. But they do it in a really smart way. So they're fine. Gender utopia, basically. Seeing how it can all work and coexist, even though everybody at every turn is sort of, stepping out of line, as it were, from their traditional gender roles. Then the culture, represented by the maids, comes in and they're like, oh, this is all wrong. You'll see. The truth of the matter is this. And that sends Tony and Angela, they aren't themselves anymore, right? So when they revert to Tony Tony digs his heels in and says, oh, okay, I'm just a maid, then I'll be a maid, right? They start to perform their traditional roles, the roles that they are actively breaking. They revert back, right? Tony becomes a Jeeves like butler maid type. And he highlights how ridiculous the norm is. I think they both do. In their trying to conform, that's their way of saying, see how ridiculous this is? If we buy into the societal norms and things like that, and how we're supposed to be, and how we're supposed to interact, and how we're supposed to relate to each other, it 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 looks ridiculous. It is ridiculous. I think that's a statement that the show makes on the down low a little bit. A couple of you mentioned this in your comments, but it's important that neither, who was it? Yeah, Ryan mentioned people can break the mold of gender norms and still maintain gender identity, right? I think a lot is lost, and this came up in class too. A lot is lost if Tony sort of plays an effeminate, foppish housekeeper, and if Angela is is more masculinized because she owns a company and she's the boss, right? She maintains her femininity, right? She wears those hair. She's still very feminine in the position of boss. Where most bosses that are women, even today, are portrayed in this, they're bitches and they're right. They're very hyper masculinized, I guess. And same thing with Tony. Like they make it a point. I think Tom mentioned this. They make it a point to show his masculinity. The tank tops, and he's boxing, and he's running the exercise class, and he played Major League Baseball, and like they're, the whole Italian thing, playing that up. Like if he's not Tony Danza, as Jake seemed very excited that it was Tony Danza. If it's not TD, this show doesn't work on this level the way it does, the way it could. Um, so they made a point of being like, no, he can't lose any of his masculinity just because he's this housekeeper. Right. That was important to this larger goal of, doing something with the notion of gender roles in our culture. Um, they end up, yeah, I just mentioned that. And we got talking about power and in systems of oppression, capitalist systems of oppression, things like that. When you just shift power from one side to the other, generally the same dynamics exist, right? Of conflict, basically. Um, you need to work toward the middle, incorporate the best parts of masculinity and femininity in this case, to find this utopia, as it were. We still haven't found it, but just for a minute we did, and it was called Who's the Boss? So I'm trying to think what else happens in the episode. Um, it's the whole series works this way until the end. I mentioned this in class. Like, eventually it became about, oh, will they or won't they? Will Angela and Tony ever hook up or get together? And like season 8 was pretty much that. It was about them as a couple, and like, it's just stupid TV bullshit. Um, Stupid sitcom bullshit. But the work had been done, I think. Um, and it just it handles some pretty complex ideas in a funny and I think nuanced way. And isn't that what life is about, friends? So, not too many comments, but any comment is a worthy comment. Um, Thinking that Tony and Angela were married was just super funny to me. And I guess I liked Jackie's point that this, the fact that many of you, multiple students, had the same reaction indicates our own gender biases, right? If you turn the show on and immediately assumed, oh, the guy's the husband and the girl, the man's the husband and the woman's the wife, and those are their kids, that we immediately, like, we're, I don't want to say hardwired because I think all this stuff is learned. Um, but I like that Jackie made that point. Like the fact that several of you jumped right to this conclusion, oh, it's a man and a woman, they must be married, um, is is astute. I like that. Um, Tom, I mentioned, he brought up that it's important that they maintain their masculinity and their femininity in these other roles, and that tied into Ryan's comment about you can break gender norms but still maintain gender identity, which I thought was I think that's the right way to word that. Um, like those 2 points, I think, were important. They could have easily, and it probably would have been way more hilarious in 1984 because people would have got it more quickly if Tony was feminized as the housekeeper and Angela was masculinized as the CEO of this ad agency. Like that would have made more sense to people in 1984, which is why I think again this show is extremely progressive in the ways that it manipulated and examined gender in in our country. Um, Jake, I love that Jake called his aerobics class a Pilates class, as if Pilates was a thing in 1984. It's probably more of like a jazzercise, and you can Google that if you'd like. I didn't look. I'm assuming the ladies had leg warmers on. Leg warmers were a thing, which are just things you wore on your calves to possibly warm your legs. Um, Pilates, I don't think existed, but I appreciated what I think was a joke. And yoga lattes it would be a while before that was invented. Um, and then Lizzie mentioned that the show illustrates, and I guess I've been talking around this point for the last half hour, but um, Who's the Boss shows that gender roles are merely social constructs, things that we have put in place to, I don't know, help uh, help understand people, but they don't typically work that way. I think we like to think that they do. Like it's easier to understand people if they fit into these very rigid and specific roles or norms. Um, but seldom does it work out that way. Um, and Lizzie also brought up the there's no one way, my little thing about there's no one way to be black, there's no one way to be a thing, as it were. So whatever it is that you are, there's no one way to be it. No one way to be a man, no one way to be a woman, or a housekeeper, or a CEO, or the you see. Um, and I like that. And then she brought up Melissa and Joey, which I'm just shocked that you watch that show. It's so dreadful. And Joey Lawrence looks like a cancer patient. I'm not. He shaves his head, but it looks like put they sprayed hair onto him. I never made the connection between Melissa and Joey and Who's the Boss. Melissa and Joey was a hey, these two characters, these two actors were famous in the 90s. Let's reboot. Let's let them work together and see if nostalgia still works. It worked on me. Right? Melissa Joan Hart was Clarissa Explains It All, one of the original Nickelodeon shows. But then she was Sabrina the Teenage Witch as well. And Joey Lawrence was not only a pop star, but he was on famous on Give Me a Break in the 80s as a little kid, and then Blossom in the 90s. And they thought, perfect. So props to Lizzie for bringing up. Props? Maybe not props. I will acknowledge Lizzie bringing up Melissa and Joey. All right, so there's your Who's the Boss video. Hope you enjoyed it. I'll see you guys again someday.